The FBI built the entire science of serial killer profiling from interviews with just 36 people, 36 convicted murderers, voluntary interviews, no standardized questions, no controlled methodology. And that research done in the late 1970s by two agents driving between prisons in their spare time is still the backbone of how law enforcement classifies serial killers today. So, does it actually work? Here's why this matters more than you might think. When a serial killer is active and unidentified, investigators don't have a name. They don't have a face. What they have is a crime scene. And what they need fast is an answer to a very specific question. What kind of person did this? The classification system is supposed to answer that. It's supposed to let investigators look at evidence and work backward from the crime scene to the behavior to the person. And from there, narrow down a suspect pool, decide where to look, who to interview, what to expect. If the classification system is accurate, it saves time. It closes cases. It stops killers before they kill again. If it's wrong, and there's documented evidence that it sometimes is investigators chase the wrong profile, look in the wrong direction, and miss windows they can't reopen. So this isn't academic. The FBI's classification system for serial killers is a practical tool used in active investigations. And what I'm going to walk you through today is exactly what that system is, how it was built, where it works, where it breaks down, and which killers exposed its limits in the most dramatic ways. The year is 1978. Two FBI agents, Robert Ressler and John Douglas, are driving around the country teaching local law enforcement about criminal psychology. Between stops, they start pulling over at prisons. The idea was Ressler's. He wanted to interview convicted killers, not to build profiles of them specifically, but to create a database. What do these men have in common? What patterns show up? If you study enough of them, can you predict the next one? They'd show up at a prison unannounced, ask if any notorious inmates wanted to talk, and sit down, no script, no fixed questions, just conversation. Over roughly 2 years, they interviewed 36 convicted murderers, including Edmund Kemper, John Wayne Gacy, Ted Bundy, and David Berkowitz. The initial plan was to interview 100 people. They got 36. The sample wasn't random, it was whoever was willing to talk. The interviews weren't structured, and some of the 36 weren't even serial killers by the definition the FBI would later use. From those 36 conversations, Robert Ressler and John Douglas built the organized/disorganized typology, the framework that still underlies FBI profiling today. That's the origin story. Keep it in mind as we go through what they built. The first and most fundamental classification the FBI uses is the organized/disorganized split. It's exactly what it sounds like, and it's more useful than it sounds. An organized killer plans. He selects a victim in advance or targets a specific type. He brings his weapons to the scene and takes them away afterward. He controls the victim before and during the crime. He often moves the body. He takes steps to destroy or remove forensic evidence. After the crime, he follows media coverage, sometimes inserts himself into the investigation, and generally remains calm. In his regular life, he holds down a job, maintains relationships, and appears completely normal to the people around him. Ted Bundy is the textbook organized killer. Charming, methodical, a law student. He premeditated everything. He had a type young women with long hair parted in the middle. He moved bodies. He engaged with investigators confidently. Nobody who knew him suspected anything. A disorganized killer is the opposite. Crimes are impulsive, opportunistic, often chaotic. The weapon is grabbed from whatever's available at the scene. The body is left where it fell, with no attempt to conceal it. There's excessive, frenzied violence far beyond what was needed. Evidence is left everywhere. In his regular life, he's isolated, unemployed, or underemployed, and often has a documented history of mental illness. The Vampire of Sacramento, Richard Chase, is the disorganized prototype. He killed 6 people in a 30-day span in January 1978. His crimes were completely disorganized, frenzied, chaotic, evidence-saturated crime scenes that practically announced his presence. He was unemployed, mentally ill, and living in total social isolation. He was caught within a month. The FBI's argument is that the crime scene directly reflects the personality of the killer. Organized crime scene, organized mind. Disorganized crime scene, disorganized mind. The organized/disorganized model worked reasonably well as a first pass. The problem was that the real world kept producing killers who didn't fit cleanly into either box. So the FBI added a third category, mixed. A mixed offender shows characteristics of both types, sometimes within the same crime, sometimes across different crimes in a series. They might plan the initial approach meticulously, but become disorganized during the commission of the crime. Or they might start out disorganized in their early kills and become more organized over time as they gain experience. BTK Dennis Rader is a partial example. He was largely organized. He planned his crimes, wrote detailed accounts of them afterward, maintained a completely normal life for 31 years as a church president and compliance officer. But his communications with police were chaotic, increasingly erratic, and ultimately his downfall. He didn't behave like a purely organized killer in every dimension. The mixed category was the FBI's first concession that the binary model was too simple. It wouldn't be the last. Parallel to the organized/disorganized framework, criminologists Holmes and DeBurger developed a 4-type classification based on motive, what drives the killer to kill. This is the system that gets used more often when investigators are trying to predict behavior and victim selection, not just reconstruct a crime scene. The FBI's crime classification manual incorporated these categories. Here's how each one works. Type 1. Visionary. These killers are driven by psychosis, genuine breaks from reality. They hear voices, experience hallucinations, or hold fixed delusions that command them to kill. David Berkowitz, the son of Sam, claimed a demon spoke through his neighbor's dog. Herbert Mullen believed he was performing human sacrifices to prevent an earthquake from destroying California. Visionary killers are typically disorganized. Their victim selection often appears random because it's driven by internal logic that's invisible to outsiders. That randomness makes them harder to profile. There's no consistent pattern to look for. They're usually caught quickly because they leave behind significant evidence and often have no coherent strategy to avoid detection. Type 2. Mission-oriented. The mission-oriented killer has decided that a particular group of people should not exist and has appointed himself to eliminate them. He doesn't hear voices. He isn't psychotic. He has a goal. Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer, told investigators after his arrest that he killed sex workers because, in his words, he hated prostitutes. He framed it as a mission. He was organized, methodical, and specific in his targeting. This type is dangerous precisely because they're rational. Their logic is warped, but it's functional. They plan, they learn, they adapt. Type 3. Hedonistic killers kill for pleasure, but the FBI breaks this down further into 3 subtypes. Lust killers are sexually motivated. The act of killing is intertwined with sexual gratification, often involving sadistic elements before and after death. Jeffrey Dahmer falls into this category. Thrill killers get their gratification from the act itself, the hunt, the control, the fear of the victim. It's an adrenaline-driven motive. Bundy overlaps here significantly. Comfort killers are motivated by material gain, money, inheritance, insurance. These are often quieter, more calculated crimes. Aileen Wuornos had elements of this. So did many of history's poisoners. Type 4. Power/control. The primary motive isn't sex, and it isn't a mission. It's dominance. These killers need absolute control over another human being in the moment of death. They often prolong the process because the control itself is the point, not the outcome. Ted Bundy is classified here as much as anywhere. He didn't primarily kill for sexual gratification in the conventional sense. He killed because he needed to dominate. John Wayne Gacy fits here too. So does BTK. The name itself is the motivation. Bind, torture, kill, control at every stage. Understanding the typology is one thing. The practical question is, how do investigators use it? The FBI's profiling process, technically called criminal investigative analysis, has 6 steps. Step 1. Profiling inputs. Collect everything available: crime scene photos, autopsy reports, victimology data, witness statements. Nothing is excluded at this stage. Step 2. Decision process models. Organize the information into a framework. How was the victim selected? What does the crime scene suggest about planning? Was there a cooling-off period consistent with serial activity? Step 3. Crime assessment. This is where organized/disorganized becomes a working hypothesis. Based on physical evidence, what type of person is likely responsible? Step 4. Criminal profile. The actual output: estimated age range, likely employment, probable background, geographic area. This is what gets sent to investigators. Step 5. Investigation. The profile narrows the suspect pool and shapes the investigation's direction. Step 6. Apprehension. If an arrest is made and the profile is compared to the actual perpetrator, this closes the loop and feeds back into the database for future refinement. The critical point is that the profile is a working hypothesis, not a conclusion. FBI agents are trained to treat it as a tool to generate leads, not as a suspect list. The problem is how it gets used downstream, when local investigators with less training treat a behavioral profile as more definitive than it's meant to be. Give credit where it's due. There are cases where classification directly led to a catch. The Nebraska child murders, 1983. 3 boys murdered in the Omaha area. No obvious suspect. The BSU wrestler, Douglas, and researcher Ann Burgess profiled the likely killer as a young male, socially awkward, working near the victim's school routes. That profile helped focus the investigation on John Joseph Joubert IV, a 20-year-old airman who was caught, convicted, and executed in 1996. It was one of the first validated uses of profiling on an active case, Ted Bundy's recapture. After Bundy escaped from a Colorado courthouse in 1977 and fled to Florida, the FBI's profile helped focus the alert on exactly the right type of target: young women on college campuses. 5 days after the FBI distributed its profile, a Florida police officer pulled Bundy over for erratic driving. The classification framework had shaped the prior that got him caught. The Atlanta child murders, 1981. Local investigators were convinced they were looking for a white offender. John Douglas profiled the killer as a young black male, based on the reasoning that a white man moving through predominantly black neighborhoods would have drawn notice. He was right. Wayne Williams was arrested. The classification pushed investigators toward the right answer against the prevailing assumption. Here's where it gets complicated. The organized/disorganized model was built from 36 interviews, no random sampling. The researchers later acknowledged the methodology was, in the words of Ann Burgess, who collaborated with them, poorly structured and had zero footing in any conventional school of research. British psychologist David Cantor ran the most rigorous empirical test of the organized/disorganized typology in 2004, analyzing 100 serial murder cases against the FBI's own criteria. His finding: there was no clear evidence that the two types actually existed as distinct categories. Almost every killer showed characteristics of both. The organized and disorganized descriptors were present in overlapping ways that didn't support clean classification. The cases that exposed this most clearly: Israel Keyes, one of the most unusual killers of the 21st century. He was so organized it was almost theatrical. He buried murder kits around the country years in advance, flew to victim locations, rented cars under false names, waited months between kills, and deliberately chose victims with no connection to him. He was also completely impulsive and sadistic in the actual commission of crimes. He defied every category. The FBI's own investigators said he fit neither organized nor disorganized in any clean sense. Gary Ridgway again. Ridgway was classified as organized, which he largely was, but he also contaminated his own crime scenes, deliberately, by leaving other people's cigarettes, gum, and written materials near the bodies to confuse investigators. He moved victims across state lines. He returned to the bodies repeatedly. The organized model predicted a controlled, careful personality, and Ridgway was that, but it didn't predict the ways he actively exploited the investigators' own assumptions about what organized meant. The BTK failure. For 31 years, BTK operated in a small geographic area, taunted police publicly, and communicated obsessively with media and law enforcement. An organized killer operating in a defined zone and seeking attention was supposed to be identifiable from those behavioral markers alone. It wasn't enough. The profile described his type accurately. It didn't narrow the suspect pool to a useful size. In 2005, the FBI did something unusual. It convened a formal symposium. 135 experts, academics, clinicians, and law enforcement professionals specifically to revisit the definition and classification of serial murder. The conclusion that came out of that symposium was significant. The participants agreed to drop motivation as a classification criterion entirely. The FBI's revised definition: the unlawful killing of two or more victims by the same offender in separate events. No required motive, no required minimum of 3 victims, 2 or more separate events. That's a significant retreat from the complex typology system that had been the standard. It acknowledges that trying to classify killers by motive from a crime scene alone is too unreliable to be definitionally useful. The classification system's organized/disorganized, the motive-based 4 types, are still used as investigative tools. They're just no longer treated as the foundation of the definition itself. The organized/disorganized model isn't dead. It's being refined. VICAP, the FBI's Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, is essentially the living version of what Ressler and Douglas started in 1978. Instead of 36 interviews, it now has hundreds of thousands of cases. Pattern recognition across that database is where the real advancement is happening. Genetic genealogy has added an entirely new layer. Cold cases that behavioral profiling couldn't crack are now being solved by DNA databases. The Golden State Killer was caught not through profiling, but through a genealogy website, and academic criminologists have pushed hard toward geographic profiling, using spatial analysis of crime scenes to estimate where an offender likely lives or works, as a more empirically valid tool than personality-based classification. The direction is away from "what type of person is this?" and toward "what patterns does this behavior produce?" and from patterns to predictions that can be tested quantitatively. The classification system the FBI built in 1978 from 36 interviews was a genuine breakthrough for its time. It got investigators thinking systematically about behavior. It closed cases. It created an entire discipline. And it's being replaced, slowly, partially, with better data, by something more rigorous. That's how science is supposed to work. That's the full breakdown of the system, how it was built, what it does, and where its limits are. If you want more of this, no speculation, just the actual data and documented cases, hit subscribe. This channel covers the research that doesn't make it into the documentaries. Next video, the psychological profiles that were completely wrong cases where the FBI built a profile, investigators followed it, and it led them in entirely the wrong direction. The Beltway snipers, the Atlanta child murders initial assumptions, the profile that pointed away from BTK for 31 years. That one drops next week. I'll see you there.